Do you know who the youngest president was? It was Theodore Roosevelt. Stay tuned as we look at the career of the 26th president.
Here is the question of the day, which will be answered at the end of today's program. Did Washington pray at Valley Forge?
One of Theodore Roosevelt's early positions in politics was the police commissioner of New York. And you think, is that a big deal? Well, New York had crime. And before the mafia came to New York, the local police ran the crime in their districts. That's right. It was them getting bribes here and turning a blind eye to something over there. And it became notorious that it was all structured crime and the local police were involved in it. And so in 1894, the mayor of New York appointed Theodore Roosevelt to the city police commissioners, where he became the president of the board, and he reformed the department, cleaning out corruption and installing telephones in the station houses. And Theodore Roosevelt actually walked the officers' beats with the officer on the streets after midnight to make sure they were on duty and to make sure there was no corruption. And Theodore Roosevelt went around on Sunday to make sure all the stores were closed. Why? Well, New York had the Sunday closing blue laws, which were in place to make sure that everything was closed on Sunday. Why? To promote observance of the Lord's Day of worship. Well, Theodore Roosevelt was the first to bring Jews into the police force. He called them his Maccabees, referring back to when the Greeks and then the Syrians controlled the Holy Land, and you had the Maccabees overthrew the pagan leaders. And then the Feast of Hanukkah, as a result, when they rededicated and cleaned out the temple of all the pagan stuff. And so they were the Maccabees, and so Teddy Roosevelt was calling the Jewish police officers his Maccabees. Journalist Jacob Riis of the Evening Sun newspaper wrote in his book, How the Other Half Lives. He wrote of the terrible conditions of the millions of immigrants who had come to New York and were suffering. He writes, when Roosevelt read my book, he came. No one ever helped as he did. For 2 years, we were brothers in New York's crime-ridden Mulberry Street. There is very little ease where Theodore Roosevelt leads, as we all of us found out. The lawbreaker found it out and lived to respect him. For the first time, a moral purpose came into the street. In the light of it, everything was transformed. So here's Teddy Roosevelt. He was a straight shooter. When William McKinley was elected the 25th president, he appointed Roosevelt as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. Now, his reputation of Navy went back to Theodore Roosevelt in college writing a book on the Navy during the War of 1812. And it became a bestseller, so much so that the head of the Navy at the time ordered a copy of it put in on every ship because it described the important aspects of naval warfare. And so later, that inspired another naval officer, Alfred Thayer Mahan, to write a even more extensive book on the Navy. And with the help of Alfred Thayer Mayer, Roosevelt built up the U.S. Navy, especially battleships. And then he sent the Navy around the world. But on February 15th of 1898, while Theodore Roosevelt is the Assistant Deputy of the Navy, the Spanish-American War breaks out. The USS Navy ship Maine exploded in Havana's harbor, beginning the Spanish-American War. Roosevelt immediately sent orders for the Navy to prepare for war. So the moment that the USS Maine was blown up, Roosevelt, in his position, sent the order saying prepare for war, even though war had not yet been declared. Admiral George Dewey later credited this immediate response as a key factor in the quick victory in the Battle of Manila Bay in the Philippines. So now America was already prepared. The preparation is the best defense. Roosevelt, after he issued that order, resigned his position as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and he organized the first volunteer cavalry of Rough Riders. These were people that he had met out when he was in the Dakotas that knew how to ride horses, and he had cowboys and Indians and polo riders, the sport that you played on horseback. And so he gets them, forms this volunteer cavalry. They practice and practice, and then they're volunteers. They show up in Florida where the ships are loading soldiers for going to Cuba, and he pushes to make sure they get on the ships, and then they get down there, and then they help capture Cuba's San Juan Hill in the famous battle. Upon his return to New York in 1898, Roosevelt ran for governor, and he won. So now he's the governor of New York. In the year 1900, the Republican convention was held, and Theodore Roosevelt was chosen to be the vice presidential running mate for William McKinley's reelection. When McKinley was reelected and then suddenly assassinated on September 6, 1901, Theodore Roosevelt became America's youngest president. He was 42 years old. As the 26th U.S. president, Republican Theodore Roosevelt immediately invited Booker T. Washington. He was the first U.S. president to invite an African American to have dinner in the White House. So Booker T. Washington has dinner with Theodore Roosevelt on October 16, 1901. They had a close relationship and had many, many meetings after that. Well, this didn't go over well in the Southern Democrat states. The newspapers condemned Roosevelt, as printed in the Memphis Scimitar newspaper. It said, "The most damnable outrage which has ever been perpetrated by any citizen of the United States was committed yesterday by the president when he invited and he wrote the N-word, to dine with him in the White House. It would not be worth more than a passing notice if Theodore Roosevelt had sat down to dinner in his own home with a Pullman car porter, but Roosevelt, the individual, and Roosevelt, the president, are not to be viewed in the same light." So again, here's Roosevelt, a Republican president, inviting African-American Booker T. Washington to the White House, and the Democrats did not like this. Roosevelt addressed the Long Island Bible Society in 1901. He said, "Every thinking man realizes that the teachings of the Bible are so interwoven and entwined with our whole civic and social life that it would be literally, I do not mean figuratively, I mean literally impossible for us to figure to ourselves what that life would be if these teachings were removed, if the Bible teachings were removed." He goes on, "We would lose almost all the standards by which we now judge both public and private morals. All the standards toward which we, with more or less resolution, strive to raise ourselves. Almost every man who has, by his life work, added to the sum of human achievement of which the race is proud, has based his life work largely upon the teachings of the Bible. Among the greatest men, a disproportionately large number have been diligent and close students of the Bible at first hand." Theodore Roosevelt went on took his era's version of big tech globalists. So back then they had the big companies. So today we have these big tech internet companies that are amassing huge, enormous amounts of money and tracking everyone and wanting to have a global control of information. Well, back then, the big elites were the globalist type companies of industrialists. And so Teddy Roosevelt got the reputation of a trust buster, breaking up monopolies such as John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Company. Who was John D. Rockefeller? Well, he gained his wealth through oil, and some of the more questionable practices was the oil was shipped on railroads. And he would go to the railroad, a particular railroad company, and say, ship my oil cheaper than my competitors. He would sell it cheaper, put his competitors out of business, then he would have a monopoly, and then he would raise the price of oil through the roof, and with that extra money would pay back the railroad for the original lowering of the price plus more. So it would benefit the railroad to do this under the table deal with John D. Rockefeller. And through that method, John D. Rockefeller became the richest man in the world with his Standard Oil Company. And so this power concentrated more and more was a threat to free market and the upward mobility of others. So Theodore Roosevelt exposed this deep state corruption also in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the Land Office, and the Post Office. So you had people in these offices that were doing corrupt things. After Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle, that was written in 1906, Roosevelt harnessed public opinion to pass the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act. So Upton Sinclair's book talked about the meat industry and talking about how it was not regulated and all kinds of things could get chopped up, including workers who were working in the meat factory would fall into some machine and they would chop it up and just put it all out as sausage and so forth. And so with that, Teddy Roosevelt pushed through the Meat Act to have the government regulate. So if you were buying something that said beef, it was actually beef. Theodore Roosevelt intervened to settle labor disputes. In politics, Roosevelt sought to replace the concentrated power of big business with the concentrated power of big government, which, unbeknownst to him, would create its own set of problems in the future. So the situation he faced was Democrats had slavery in the Deep South. Lincoln, Republican, was good. He ended slavery. And the Republicans more or less had a monopoly on the federal government for a decade or so. And you had people that climbed the ladder, got into positions, and would sort of use their positions for their own benefit. And then this ended up being the corruption that Teddy Roosevelt decided that he would stop. Well, we'll be back for some more of the youngest president in U.S. history.
What history altered the course of the Pilgrims and the future of America?
The treacherous world of the 16th century and how the Pilgrims escaped it.
For your gift of $25 or more, understand the insurmountable odds the Pilgrims overcame to escape persecution.
It takes you back centuries into what was going on in Europe that caused the Pilgrims to want to come to America in the first place.
Reach back in time and discover facts never before revealed about the Pilgrims' journey to America.
The treacherous world of the 16th century and how the Pilgrims escaped it. A great gift for your children and your grandchildren.
Faith in History's William Feder reveals the Pilgrims' plight and illuminates their struggle to reach the Americas. Give your gift of $25 or more and own this compelling prequel to American freedom, told from a biblical perspective. Call 866-338-5033.
Did you know that Theodore Roosevelt created the U.S. Forest Service, designating national parks? Matter of fact, 5 national parks, 18 U.S. national monuments, 51 bird reserves, 4 game preserves, 150 national forests, and being responsible for a total of 121 forest reserves in 31 states. So here is Theodore Roosevelt, his years of being a rancher in the Dakotas gave him a love for the West and for nature, and he saw that as the country would grow, a lot of that land would be developed, and some of it was just so special with the Old Faithful and the geysers and the sequoia forests out in California that he took the responsibility of setting it aside for future generations. So Theodore Roosevelt in total set 230 million acres under public protection, and by the end of his second term established 150 million acres of reserved forest land. Well, why is this important? Well, if you look at other areas of the world as the development came, especially in the Middle East, at the time of Abraham, there was lots of trees in there. But over time, the Middle East chopped down all the trees and it became a barren wasteland. And so the idea is that if land is set aside, it would preserve these forests and preserve the wild animals and so forth. In 1904, Roosevelt assisted in negotiating a Japan-Russian treaty. So back then, Japan and Russia were enemies, and Teddy Roosevelt steps in 1904, does this treaty. He wins the Nobel Peace Prize. Unfortunately, the peace didn't last but a couple decades when World War I started. Well, nevertheless, Roosevelt intervened in the first Moroccan crises over there in Morocco in North Africa. He intervened in the Venezuelan crises, and he settled disputes with Britain over the Alaskan border. Roosevelt helped Panama separate from Colombia, and he began building the Panama Canal. Roosevelt argued for protection of Jews in North Africa. Ambassador Michael B. Oren noted in Power, Faith, and Fantasy that in Roosevelt's negotiations with Morocco, he insisted they, quote, secured his country's customary concerns in the area, protecting North African Jews from oppression and American merchants from unfair restrictions and fees. Roosevelt pressured Romania and Russia to treat their Jewish populations fairly. What was going on? Well, the play, The Fiddler on the Roof, that takes place during Tsar's Nicholas there in Russia, and the Jews are being treated bad and being chased out, and many of them came to America, others to Europe, and others to different areas, and Theodore Roosevelt responded by condemning the treatment, the harsh treatment of the Jews in Romania and Russia. After a massacre of Jews in Kishinev in the Belus-Arabia Governorate of the Russian Empire, Roosevelt responded to this massacre of Jews. He said, "I need not dwell upon a fact so patent as the widespread indignation with which the Americans heard of the dreadful outrage upon the Jews in Kishinev." In 1906, Roosevelt became the first president to appoint a Jew to a cabinet member. He was the Secretary of Commerce and Labor, Oscar Solomon Strauss, who owned, with his brother, the Macy's department store. So they have Strauss brothers, and they own Macy's department store in New York, where the Thanksgiving Day parade is, and it was Theodore Roosevelt that put him on his cabinet. Roosevelt wrote of Strauss, "I don't know whether you know it or not, but I want you to become a member of my cabinet. I have a very high estimate of your character, your judgment, and your ability, and I want you for personal reasons. There is still a further reason. I want to show Russia and some other countries what we think of Jews in this country." Roosevelt stated, "To discriminate against a thoroughly upright citizen because he belongs to some particular church or because, like Abraham Lincoln, he has not avowed his allegiance to any church, it is an outrage against the liberty of conscience. In my cabinet, at the present moment, there sit side by side Catholic and Protestant, Christian and Jew, each man chosen because, in my belief, he is peculiarly fit to exercise on behalf of all our people the duties of the office. We'll be right back.
Here is the answer to today's question. Did Washington pray at Valley Forge? In the freezing winter of 1777 at Valley Forge, soldiers died at the rate of 12 per day. Washington wrote, quote, "To see men without clothes to cover their nakedness, without blankets to lay on, without shoes, by which their marches might be traced by the blood from their feet," unquote. Quaker farmer Isaac Potts reported seeing in the woods, quote, "the commander-in-chief on his knees in the act of devotion to the ruler of the universe," unquote. From his headquarters at Valley Forge, General Washington ordered April 12, 1778, quote, "Congress having thought to recommend a day of fasting, humiliation, and prayer, that at one time and with one voice the righteous dispensations of Providence may be acknowledged, and his goodness and mercy towards our arms supplicated and implored. The General directs that the day shall be most religiously observed in the army, that no work shall be done thereon, and that the several chaplains do prepare discourses suitable to the occasion," unquote.
Theodore Roosevelt was a member of the Dutch Reformed Church in New York. Now, for those not familiar with New York history, New York was founded by the Dutch. It was originally New Amsterdam, and the Dutch Reformed Church was the official denomination for New York. And they had a St. Nicholas Dutch Reformed Church that grew. It was this enormous cathedral. As the city became more financial and less residential, the attendance of the church dropped, and they sold it to the Sinclair Oil Company, who tore it down, built an oil building. That church moved out to become the Marlboro Collegiate Church, and it was a notable church, still is to this day, and even President Donald Trump had gone there. Well, so the Dutch Reformed Church in New York, it was very historic, and a member of the Dutch Reformed Church was Theodore Roosevelt. He writes in 1909, "After a week of perplexing problems, it does so rest my soul to come into the house of the Lord and to sing and mean it, Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty. My great joy and glory, that in occupying an exalted position in the nation, I am enabled to preach the practical moralities of the Bible to my fellow countrymen and to hold up Christ as the hope and Savior of the world." After his presidency, he helped William Howard Taft become the 27th president. Roosevelt then led a Smithsonian safari in Africa in 1809. He traveled to Egypt. He met with Austrian-Hungarian Emperor Franz Joseph. He met with Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II, England's King George V, and other European leaders. In St. Louis, Missouri, 1910, Roosevelt was the first person who had been president to fly in an airplane. Of course, it was just the two wings with the pilot sitting out in with the motor and the goggles on, and Roosevelt was on the side, and they only flew like 100 yards over, like in front of a stand of bandstand with people watching, and the pilot had to make Roosevelt stop waving because it was rocking the plane. When a proposal was in 1910 to add a designation of religion to passports, it was opposed by American Jews who were being denied entrance into Russia. Roosevelt opposed the proposal of adding your religion to your passport, writing to Israel Fisher, June 30th, 1911, "I would not put in the word Hebrew. I believe from the standpoint of the Christian, just as much as from the standpoint of the Jew, it is ill-advised to treat what is really a religious matter as a race matter. I know plenty of men, some of them very prominent men, who are mixed race. And personally, I should no more have a man entered on a passport as a Hebrew than as an Episcopalian or a Baptist or a Roman Catholic. Roosevelt wrote, "It seems to me that it is entirely proper to start a Zionist state around Jerusalem." And so he was in favor of the Jews having their homeland. He attempted to run for president again in 1912, forming the Bull Moose Party. His platform was to destroy this invisible government, which is the deep state elites, to dissolve the unholy alliance between corrupt business and corrupt politics. At a campaign speech in Milwaukee, October 14th, 1912, a saloon keeper shot Roosevelt in the chest. The bullet didn't hit any vital organs. Roosevelt stood back up and finished his speech. Well, we're out of time on hearing about Theodore Roosevelt, but I want to encourage you to watch this again. You can go to tct.tv. While you're there, I invite you to contribute. Your gifts are greatly appreciated and help us to continue these broadcasts. And you can give by calling 800-232-9855. 800-232-9855, or write us at P.O. Box 1010, Marion, Illinois, 62959. Again, thank you in advance. And this message is so important that we learn our history so that we can go back and realize the godly Christian roots that helped make this nation great. God bless you. Thank you again for your support. Have a great day.
Faith in History is a TCT Network exclusive production. For more Faith in History, send your support to TCT. Thanks for watching.